I knew it was probably going to happen for probably about a month. And I'm just like, pull the trigger, dude. Come on.
The NFL is raging against the Detroit Lions management after it got revealed that they were double-crossing Frank Ragnow. The message they're sending is clear, and it might be costly for the franchise if they don't listen. Things are heating up, so let's get into it. The man who gave everything and then got a bill. Every franchise has a moment that defines how it actually treats its own people, a moment that separates the organizations that talk about brotherhood, about family, about sacrifice, from the ones that actually live those values when it costs them something real. For the Detroit Lions, that moment arrived quietly in the summer of 2025. It arrived when one of the toughest, most physically selfless players to ever pull on that Honolulu blue jersey walked away from the game, not because he wanted to, not because the passion had dried up, not because he'd grown tired of competing at the highest level, but because his body had simply exhausted every last thing it had left to give. And then, sometime after that, the bill arrived. This is the story of Frank Ragnow, a story about what it actually costs, in human terms, to be the kind of football player who takes the field with a fractured throat, who comes back to the offensive line just 1 week after meniscus surgery, stitches still in his knee, still healing from the table, who lines up every single Sunday carrying an inoperable, unrepairable toe, a toe that doctors cannot fix, a toe that just has to be endured. And then, after all of that, after all those years of that, gets asked to give something back. Before the controversy can mean anything, you have to understand exactly who Frank Ragnow is. Because without that foundation, without that picture of the man himself, what follows doesn't hit the way it deserves to. A 4-time Pro Bowler, Ragnow was for years the undisputed cornerstone of the Detroit Lions offensive line. One of those players that fans talk about in lowered, reverent tones, not because of spectacular highlight reel moments, not because his name trends after game-winning plays, but because of the way he showed up every single week, regardless of what the injury report said, regardless of what his body was quietly begging him to do differently. He was the kind of center that opposing defensive coordinators built entire game plans around, the kind of player whose value to a team shows up not in the moments he creates, but in the chaos he prevents, the protection he provides, and the culture he carries just by being present. In 2021, the Lions rewarded that loyalty and that sustained excellence with a 4-year, $54 million contract extension that included a $6 million signing bonus. That is what this organization decided he was worth. That is the dollar figure they put on the question of how much they needed him to stay. And he wasn't just an offensive lineman. He was a pillar, a load-bearing pillar, of a franchise in the middle of the most meaningful rebuild it had attempted in decades, trying to become something real under head coach Dan Campbell's relentlessly emotional, player-first philosophy. For years after that contract, Ragnow delivered. He played through pain that would have shelved other players for months. He tolerated injuries in silence that would have sent other men to the operating room and never fully come back. He was, in every honest sense of the phrase, exactly what the Detroit Lions asked him to be, and then some. But bodies have limits, and the human body, even one as tough and disciplined as Frank Ragnow's, eventually presents an invoice of its own. Ragnow retired in June 2025 at just 29 years old, citing health concerns after years of playing through significant injuries, with 2 full years remaining on his contract. Take a moment with that. He was not walking away from a team he'd given up on. He was not walking away from a coaching staff he had grown distant from, or a paycheck he had decided wasn't worth the effort. He was walking away because continuing to play professional football would have cost him something far more valuable than any contract in the NFL could compensate. His retirement announcement focused not on frustration, not on grievances against the organization, but on long-term health and family. It was a graceful, dignified exit from a man who had given this franchise everything a professional athlete can give. But there was one more thing the Lions would ask of him. In the NFL, the mechanics of signing bonus repayment work like this. Signing bonuses are paid up front to the player, but prorated, spread out over the full length of the contract for salary cap accounting purposes. When a player retires early, and that retirement is classified as voluntary, rather than a team or doctor-declared medical retirement, the team can exercise its contractual rights under Article 4, Section 9 of the collective bargaining agreement to recoup the unearned prorated portions of that bonus. It is not an under-the-table maneuver. It is written into the agreement that governs the entire league. For Ragnow, with 2 years left on his deal, approximately $3 million in remaining proration existed, and the Lions sought a portion of it. The exact sum was never publicly disclosed, but the amount, in some ways, is beside the point entirely. The story is not really about the number. Here is the detail that makes this story genuinely difficult to sit with comfortably. Frank Ragnow did not simply ride off into the sunset after retiring, he tried to come back. In November 2025, Ragnow attempted a return to help a struggling Detroit Lions team and failed a physical due to a grade 3 hamstring strain, which is a complete muscular tear, a complete tear. This same man who had already retired to protect his long-term health, attempted to unretire, to voluntarily return to professional football for a team he clearly still cared about. And his body said no, not metaphorically. The doctor said no. And so Frank Ragnow went home, for good this time. Then, in late March 2026, reports surfaced confirming the Lions' decision regarding his prorated bonus. And Lions president Rod Wood did not shy away from it. He stepped to the microphone and delivered the organization's position with a clarity that was, perhaps, more candid than it was careful. Our precedent goes all the way back to Barry Sanders, and I think the reality is, they're not paying back their money, they're returning our money, because they were paid in advance for services that they hadn't completed. It's the Lions' money, it's not the players' money. Those last 8 words. It's the Lions' money, it's not the players' money. They hit the NFL world like a bucket of cold, clear front office arithmetic, because the problem wasn't just the decision, it was the framing. This was not a quiet, mutually respectful settlement handled behind closed doors with the dignity the situation deserved. This was a public declaration, a policy statement delivered from the podium, and what was coming next would be fierce. The locker room speaks, and so do the fans. When NFL organizations make decisions that affect players, the people who feel those decisions most immediately, most viscerally, are not the people watching on television. They are not the analysts breaking down the cap implications. They are the players, the men who spend every day inside those facilities, who share that locker room air, who know firsthand, not theoretically, but in their joints and their scar tissue, exactly what it costs a human body to do what Frank Ragnow did for 16 regular season weekends a year, plus preseason, plus practice, plus the quiet suffering of off-season rehabilitation. And when those players decide to speak publicly about something, it tends to carry a weight that no amount of press conference language can match. Alex Anzalone played alongside Frank Ragnow as a Detroit Lions linebacker from 2021 through the 2025 season, before signing with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the 2026 offseason. He did not watch Ragnow's sacrifices on a highlight reel. He practiced next to them. He competed beside them week after week. He saw what it looked like in real time when a man with a fractured throat still lined up and did his job. And when he saw the reports about what the Lions were now asking Ragnow to give back, he went directly to X, formerly Twitter, and he did not soften a single word of it. Anzalone posted the following: played through fractured throat, 1 week post meniscus cleanup, stitches barely out, inoperable, unrepairable toe, etc. Hey, let me get that prorated signing bonus back. Do business as business is being done. Read that once more, because there is a great deal packed into that single post. The fractured throat, the meniscus surgery is returned 1 week later, stitches barely out, the inoperable toe. These are not minor, easily forgotten footnotes in Frank Ragnow's career. These are headline injuries. These are the kinds of injuries that, in most other professions, result in extended leave, workers' compensation, and a serious conversation about whether someone should ever return to that environment at all. And Anzalone is listing them deliberately, methodically, one by one, because they are the receipts, the physical, documented, medically recorded receipts of what Frank Ragnow surrendered for this franchise. The laughing emojis following, "Hey, let me get that prorated signing bonus back," are not expressions of amusement. That is the laugh of pure, unfiltered disbelief. The laugh of a man who cannot fully process what he is watching unfold. The post amassed thousands of likes, reposts, and replies almost immediately, because it articulated, in plain and furious language, exactly what a great many people, players and fans alike, were already feeling. But Anzalone was not done. In a follow-up post, he added, "Everyone knows Frank retired because of medical. They got him on a contractual technicality. A contractual technicality." That is the phrase that cuts directly to the marrow of this entire controversy. What Anzalone is pointing at is a legal distinction that, in the specific context of Frank Ragnow's situation, feels morally paper thin. Under the CBA, there is a meaningful difference between a voluntary retirement and a medical retirement. If team doctors formally deem a player medically unfit to continue playing, the team typically cannot claw back the prorated bonus. But if the player makes the personal decision to stop, even when that decision is driven entirely and exclusively by the cumulative physical destruction absorbed over a decade of professional football, it registers as voluntary. And that is what opened the door for the Lions front office to pursue this repayment. Now, and this is important, Anzalone was precise about where he was directing his frustration. He made clear he loves Dan and the gang, Dan Campbell, the coaching staff, the people in the building building who work with players every day. This isn't a coach issue, he clarified. This is a front office issue, a business side issue. And that distinction carries real information about how players inside this organization perceive the separation between the heart of the team and the cold arithmetic of its management. Anzalone was not the only prominent NFL voice to weigh in on what was unfolding. Former Philadelphia Eagles center Jason Kelce, one of the most respected offensive linemen in recent NFL history, a man who built a career on toughness, on playing through pain, on giving everything to his franchise, also made his position known. Kelce acknowledged the legal right of teams to recoup funds in cases of voluntary retirement. He understands how the business works. He was inside it for more than a decade, but he also made clear that what happened with Ragnow was, from where he stood, a situation with an obvious answer to anyone willing to look at it honestly. Kelce described it as obvious that Ragnow retired due to cumulative injuries and pain, not casually or conveniently. That single word, obvious, is doing enormous work in that statement, because what Kelce is really saying is this: everyone who has been paying attention already knows the answer. The injuries are not disputed. The comeback attempt that ended on the medical examination table is documented. The fractured throat, the meniscus surgery, the inoperable toe, all of it is on record. This was not a player who woke up one morning and decided that the game was no longer serving his interests. This was a player whose body finally, definitively, without room for further negotiation, said enough. And yet, under the structure of the CBA as it currently exists, Ragnow's exit is classified identically to a player who simply chose to walk away without a single injury on his chart. Detroit Lions fans reacted with a mix of shock, frustration, anger, and division that was immediate, loud, and sustained. If you spent any time on social media in the days following the reports, you felt all of it at once. The dominant reaction was outrage. Fans accused the organization of being cheap as hell and of nickel and diming a man who had given his literal, measurable, documented physical body for this franchise. Comments flooded in drawing direct comparisons to the Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson situations, two other legendary Lions who departed under similar financial circumstances and whose relationships with the organization were strained and complicated for years as a result. Fans wrote things like, "The Lions quoted Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson to justify taking money from a man whose body failed him. Returning our money is cold corporate language." The story sent shockwaves through the fan base and generated national backlash, with supporters fuming that the optics of the decision were catastrophically poor, particularly given all the goodwill that had accumulated under Dan Campbell's emotionally invested player-first coaching identity. Not every Lions fan opposed the decision. A minority argued, reasonably, that the contract is the contract, that if you pay someone in advance for services they ultimately do not render, the argument for recoupment is not inherently monstrous. Others pointed out that the Lions sought only a portion of the total eligible amount, not the full $3 million that was technically available, and that Ragnow's career earnings left him financially secure regardless of the outcome. But even accounting for those voices, the scales tilt decisively in one direction. The fan base was described as divided, but make no mistake, the loudest, most sustained, most passionate reaction has been disappointment. Disappointment that a franchise working so hard to rebuild its culture, its identity, and its relationship with the city of Detroit would choose financial precedent over basic human recognition in the case of a player who left every last thing he had on this team's field: the policy, the precedent, and the sound of silence. To fully understand what's happening with Frank Ragnow, you cannot examine it in isolation. You cannot look at this moment as a singular event, a one-off decision made under unusual circumstances. You have to zoom out, significantly out, because what the Detroit Lions did here is not new. It is not a reaction to something specific about Ragnow, or this contract, or this era of the franchise. It is a policy, a decades-long, deliberately maintained, carefully and consistently enforced organizational policy. And understanding why it exists and what it says about the Detroit Lions in comparison to how the rest of the league handles similar situations is where this story becomes genuinely, uncomfortably complicated. The Detroit Lions have maintained a long-standing organizational policy of requiring players who retire voluntarily, with time remaining on their contracts, to repay a portion or all of the remaining prorated signing bonus. When Rod Wood says the precedent goes back to Barry Sanders, he is not reaching for a distant, convenient historical anchor. He means it literally. In 1999, Barry Barry Sanders, one of the greatest running backs in the history of professional football, retired abruptly before training camp. He was, at the time, within reach of Walter Payton's all-time rushing record. He was still at a level that very few players in the history of the sport had ever reached. He walked away on his own terms, as was his absolute right, and the Lions took the matter to arbitration, ultimately recovering over $7 million from Sanders' $11 million signing bonus. The dispute contributed to years of strained, publicly complicated relations between one of the most beloved athletes in Lions history and the franchise that made him famous. Then came Calvin Johnson, Megatron. In 2016, Johnson repaid at least $1.6 million from a possible $3.2 million following his retirement. One of the most physically gifted wide receivers the sport has ever produced, a man whose name will always belong in any serious conversation about the greatest to ever play his position. And for years, his relationship with the organization that drafted him was complicated. He later cited the repayment as a barrier to fully repairing his relationship with the franchise, a check written on the way out the door that created a coldness that lingered for a long time. Now, Frank Ragnow, Rod Wood's rationale for maintaining this policy across decades, across ownership changes, across public criticism, is actually internally consistent, even if it lands with the warmth of a contract clause. He has warned that making exceptions, even for star players, even for injury-related retirements in the most sympathetic cases imaginable, weakens the team's position when pursuing larger sums from others in the future. Waive the policy once, even for the most compelling, most human, most obviously justified case you can construct, and every future case becomes harder to argue. From a pure financial and contractual logic standpoint, that reasoning holds. From a human logic standpoint, it is a much, much harder sell. Here is the detail that makes the Lions' approach particularly striking when placed in the broader context of the league. While most NFL teams technically have the right to pursue these repayments under the CBA, the majority choose not to, especially in cases where retirement is clearly driven by cumulative health concerns. The mechanism exists across the entire league, but enforcement is another matter entirely. The contrast cited most often is the Indianapolis Colts and Andrew Luck. When the Colts star quarterback suddenly retired in 2019 due to ongoing injuries and mental health concerns, Indianapolis did not pursue any repayment of his $16.8 million in bonuses, not $1. The organization praised Luck's career publicly and completely, allowing him to walk away with his dignity, his finances, and his relationship with the franchise entirely intact. It is now remembered broadly as the right call, and it cost the Colts cap flexibility to make it. Other teams have pursued repayment, but typically under circumstances that look very different from Ragnow's. The San Francisco 49ers pursued repayment from Chris Borland, who retired after just one season in 2015 over concussion concerns, with Borland reportedly repaying significant amounts related to his signing bonus. The Philadelphia Eagles sought and partially recovered signing bonus money from Terrell Owens following his departure and holdout issues, with an arbitrator ruling Owens owed nearly $800,000 to complete repayment of $1.725 million. The Atlanta Falcons successfully recouped nearly $20 million in bonuses from Michael Vick via arbitration in 2007 following his legal troubles and effective forced departure from the team. These are holdouts, conduct violations, legal crises, not a player whose body gave out from a decade of extraordinary professional sacrifice. No franchise has a formal written policy of never pursuing repayment. The right exists league-wide, but teams like the Colts, and to lesser extents franchises like the Patriots, Packers, and Steelers in high-profile veteran retirement cases, are consistently cited as more player-friendly in practice. The Lions stand out specifically because of their decades-long consistency in enforcing this policy across multiple eras of the franchise, regardless of the player or the circumstances. It is not an accident. It is not an oversight. It is a choice, a deliberate, sustained organizational philosophy that prioritizes financial and contractual discipline over relational capital, even when the relational cost turns out to be enormous. And the detail that keeps circling back through all of this discussion, the one that Anzalone pointed at directly, is the distinction between a voluntary retirement and a medical retirement. Had Ragnow been formally medically retired, declared unfit by team physicians, the door to repayment would likely have been closed. But because Ragnow made the personal decision to stop, even though that decision was driven by the accumulated wreckage of years of professional football, the CBA says it's voluntary. That is the technicality. That is the seam in the agreement that the Lions stepped through. And it is a seam that many observers believe deserves serious, league-wide attention before the next version of this story writes itself. And through all of it, through Anzalone's scorched earth social media posts, through Kelsey's commentary, through Rod Wood's press conference statements, through the national media coverage and the fan reactions and the think pieces and the podcast episodes, one person has said absolutely nothing at all. Frank Ragnow. Ragnow Ragnow has maintained complete public silence on the Lions' decision to require him to repay a portion of his prorated signing bonus. No statements, no interviews, no social media posts, nothing. The man at the literal center of the storm has chosen, deliberately, completely, without apparent wavering, to step entirely out of the rain. Multiple reports explicitly note that Ragnow has stayed completely out of the public eye since his retirement. There are zero known quotes from him addressing the Lions' pursuit of his bonus money, zero social media activity in response to a controversy that has, by any reasonable measure, dominated the NFL news cycle in the days following the report surfacing around March 31st, 2026. And this silence is, in itself, a kind of statement, though what exactly it is saying remains genuinely open to interpretation. Is it the silence of a man who has made peace with the situation and decided that publicly adding to the noise would serve no one, least of all himself? Is it the silence of someone who still harbors real affection for the coaches and teammates he shared that locker room with and has no desire to poison those relationships with a public statement that the organization would have to respond to? Is it the silence of a man who is simply, completely, finally done with the attention, done with the spotlight, done with everything that came with being an NFL player, and wants nothing more than to heal quietly and be present for his family? The closest thing we have to a window into Ragnow's continued connection with this franchise is the fact that in November 2025, months after his June retirement, he voluntarily attempted to return and help a struggling Lions team and was turned away by a grade 3 hamstring tear on the examination table, not by any reluctance of his own. A man who tries to unretire to help his team is not a man nursing a quiet bitterness toward that team. That attempted comeback speaks to something real about how Ragnow felt about the Lions, the people inside that building, the mission they were on together. Whether that feeling survives this situation, whether the bonus repayment creates the kind of long-term rift that has complicated the Lions' relationships with other franchise cornerstones, is genuinely unknown, but the shadows of Barry Sanders and Calvin Johnson hang over this story like a warning the Lions have already walked past twice before. And the fact that Lions president Rod Wood declined further comment at the NFL owners' meetings beyond reiterating the decision as precedent suggests that, from the organization's side of the table, this conversation is over. Here is what we know. When you take everything in this story and lay it out honestly, end to end, Frank Ragnow played through a fractured throat, came back to the field 1 week after, meniscus surgery with the stitches still in his knee, carried an inoperable, unrepairable toe through game after game, season after season for the Detroit Lions. He was by every meaningful measure one of the most physically courageous players this franchise has ever had the privilege of putting in uniform. He signed a contract, he gave everything he had under that contract and more, and then his body told him it was finished. The Detroit Lions, operating entirely within their legal rights and in full alignment with a policy they have enforced for over 25 years, asked for some of that money back. Alex Anzalone went public with his disbelief and his disgust. Jason Kelce acknowledged the complexity, but made clear what he could see from the outside. Fans, by and large, were not happy, and Frank Ragnow, the man who lived all of it, said nothing at all. Whether you think the Lions were right, whether you accept the contractual logic, believe in the cap arithmetic, respect the value of consistent precedent in professional sports franchise management, there is one question that remains after all the legal fine print has been read and all the press conferences have ended. Is this how you treat someone who played with a fractured throat? That question doesn't have a cap implication. It doesn't resolve into a clean financial argument. It just sits there. And the fact that so many people, players, fans, media, the entire NFL world really are asking it this loudly says everything you need to know about what kind of answer they're looking for. Thank you for watching this video. If you'd like to watch another fascinating video like this, click on one of the boxes on your screen right now.